Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome remotely and virtually to the WayWORD Festival in Aberdeen. This festival is brought to you by the Word Centre for Creative Writing with the generous support of Creative Scotland and the University of Aberdeen. I'm Dr. Lucy Hinnie. I currently work as the Wikimedian in residence at the British Library and as a digital skills Wikimedian for Wikimedia UK. In my not so past life, I was a PhD candidate in Scottish literature. And I am delighted today to be speaking with you and to be speaking with Debbie Hannan. Debbie, I'm sure, will introduce themselves in just a moment. We're going to be in conversation today about contemporary Scottish theatre and Debbie's experiences as one of, I think, the most artistic people I've ever known personally, and I think one of the most visionary new directors that Scotland has proffered in the last 10 years. So it's really exciting to be here talking for you all today. It's safe to say that I've been in conversation with Debbie for most of my 20s and almost all of my 30s so far. So it's great to have a chance to speak to Debbie in front of you all today. There is a Q&A at the end of this conversation. You can ask questions by popping them in the Q&A box down in the bottom of your Zoom, or if you're in the hall with us today, I think there's someone in the hall who's going to be able to facilitate that. And I think Debbie and I would both like to extend our thanks to WayWORD for being so accommodating of the last minute pivot to online presentation. I'm coming to you from York, down in that England, and Debbie's coming to you live from North London. So we're far south, but in spirit we're up in Aberdeen. So I think that is everything. We've also got the wonderful Leslie Creerer here today to provide BSL interpretation. Leslie's spotlighted, so she should be visible throughout, but remember, if you wish to or need to, you can pin Leslie to your screen so that she always appears alongside whoever's speaking as long as your device allows it. So, Debbie, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, my name is Debbie Hannan, and I'm very embarrassed and thrilled by Lucy's kind words there. I'm a freelance theatre director and dramaturg, and have been since about the age of 19 when I made my first show, which Lucy produced at Edinburgh University. So Lucy and I have been threaded together through my whole career, and she's been a major support, which is why she's the perfect person to speak to today. I'm currently an associate artist at the National Theatre of Scotland. I was recently acting artistic director at Stockroom, which is a writer's room, the first professional writer's room in theatre, which is based in London, and I'm still an associate artist there making work today. I've directed everywhere, you name it, all over the UK as well as in Mexico. I've taken shows to Australia, to the US. I've done research for plays in India, so I've enjoyed a career both national and international, but it's always been about new work and new plays in some way. So all the writers I work with are alive, which is the main facet of my work. That means that I develop plays from anything from a draft or a first concept all the way to production, if we're lucky, all the way to production, as well as being someone who has a real love and interest in strategy and planning for the artistic landscape. How do we get emerging artists, fund them, find them, encourage them? I was brought up in Edinburgh, so I wasn't from a family that went to the theatre, but every August the theatre was all around me. So I've got a great love for finding people who think theatre isn't for them and making sure that they know that they can make and see the work and it's for them too.
Amazing. It's been really interesting to prepare for this conversation, largely because our conversations tend to be very unprepared. But I think one of the things that's really thrilled me is one of my side hustles is that I podcast about pop culture, and I sometimes get to interview people who are involved in the making of TV shows or films and things like that. And it's always a privilege to go off and read about them and find out about things they've done in the past. But this has been a really interesting and heartening thing to do, because I feel like I remember the things that are listed on your very impressive CV as they were happening. And that is a real thrill to sort of look back on your life and your friend's life, and to see that kind of growth into an artist and a professional. But I guess for the first question, and this is very much a panel about Debbie and Debbie's work in theatre, but I think I'm going to indulge with the first question and just take us back to 2007, 2008, which is when we met. And I think that the circumstances of our meeting and where we both were in our lives and as people are actually very important in where we both went from there, because I think there is a common thread in our friendship that is about what it is to be Scottish. And one of the things that I didn't mention about Debbie in the opening is that at one point Debbie was one of the 4 Scottish students at Edinburgh University, so she made up 25% of that demographic. All joking aside, shall we talk a little bit about that experience of studying making grassroots theatre in Edinburgh and what that was like as two kind of late teens, early 20s Scots, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, you've touched on it already, but like, firstly, we were so young,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I'm a year younger than you even.
Yes, yeah.
And I bring it up often.
You do, yeah.
But I was, far, in a way, far too young, but was the first person from my family to go to university.
Mm-hmm.
And I made the second error of being from Edinburgh and going to Edinburgh Uni. And there's a certain stigma against home students. And I mean, I say stigma, it's just classism, just really brazen classism.
Yep.
And you're devalued within your home city. And that's a really surreal experience, actually. And I think you'd agree with this, and that extended to the theatre societies that went on in Edinburgh, which are actually like incredible, well-resourced places for learning. But like every other element of university is a microcosm of the wider world. So we're dominated by people with certain accents, certain privileges, and often by people who'd done a lot of theatre before, which was mad because they were mostly 19, but they'd had access to that before then. And I think you and I both found ourselves in what was dubbed the alternative theatre company called Paradox, for a reason, because it was us, along with like what tended to be like a lot of really interesting European people who didn't have an RP accent, frankly, people who wanted to make work that was site specific or just in some way, not particularly classic. And I absolutely can track my career from that theatre company to here because of the values that it held. And I remember you were president of that theatre company as I made shows in it, and I think because it started from this basis of like essentially shared values, friendship, and an underlying desire to make like work that mattered in a really kind of youthful, free way. I think it was formative in that sense. And sometimes I look back at those shows and I think, the person I am now who knows about the professional structures to make a show like that, they were madness. Like now I'm like, I'm tired even thinking about what I would do to enable us to make something like Grimm's Tales, which was a cast of 20?
Too many, I don't, like, lots of people.
12 devised rooms linked together and the audience split. I mean, and we've got in art students to build the sets for every room. Like, it was a really beautiful, massive achievement that led directly to me going to the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, and came from, I think it was a fund that you achieved. So it was built from lots of different bricks, that now maybe I'm saying as if it was just youthful freedom. It might also be 12 years of austerity, frankly. That's made me go, would that be possible now? But I'm so glad that's where I started.
Yeah, and I think it's funny what you were saying about the European nature of it. It does scare me now to think that some of the people we met and collaborated with, students now may not get that chance because of what austerity and Brexit are doing to universities and preventing people coming through. And I think there was definitely a sense of kinship amongst the oddballs, and it still, I think, makes us both quite angry that being Scottish makes you an oddball in that situation. But it did, and we rolled with it, and I think it took us to some really interesting places, and particularly artistically for you, because you went on from there to be one of was there four? Is it usually four directors per year in the conservatoire
Usually
program?
3, and then they shoved me in at the last minute. Yeah.
There you go. And that was, what was that like? What was the shift to Glasgow like for you?
Oh, I mean, I've well, as I said, I grew up in Edinburgh, but I've been a big city seeker
Mm-hmm.
since young. I've only ever wanted to go bigger and bigger, which
Yeah.
is how I ended up working in New York and then Mexico City. I don't know what's
Yeah.
left. Maybe Seoul in Korea. Like it's like,
Yeah.
you know, and so, but at that point, the move to Glasgow was extremely fulfilling of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think I found as well, my family are very West Coast, and it
Mm-hmm.
was quite reconnecting to something that was quite deep rooted.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the primary part of that is a really similar line of inquiry to what you just said. Is there's a beautiful history of the Scottish working class autodidact, like
Yeah.
there, you know, you can be from mining heritage as I am,
Mm-hmm.
but you will have a hell of a lot of books in your house, you know.
Yes.
And there's not that binary division that I found is a little bit more present in England.
Mm-hmm.
I'm speaking very broadly, but
Mm-hmm.
deliberately to feel out the characteristics of it. Where to go west was to reconnect with that tradition. You know, in Glasgow, you've got the Citizens Theatre, which puts on that quite, you know, high end Jean
Yeah.
Genet, The Maids with Rupert Everett in the
Mm-hmm.
middle of the Gorbals.
Yeah.
And
50p tickets.
50p tickets, there's no division there. Like the art really is for you. And I think I'd been long gifted with that sense of like, if somewhere like an arena or an art form feels like it's not for me, I'm gonna like elbow my way in because it
Mm-hmm.
is. And I do think that's a really specifically West Coast
Yeah.
Lowlander quality that
Well, I'm from the northeast, so I can't comment. It would just devolve, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, it does kind of lead into my next question, actually. So one of the things that we've spoken about over the years in relation to your work, I think work with NTS and work with kind of touring more broadly is the Scotland as a monolith. So obviously we're both based in across the border now, and there is a tendency to view Scotland as being one thing, and that thing is Glasgow or Edinburgh, but that is it.
yeah.
And I was wondering, because we're in Aberdeen, we're talking with my hometown, my home kind of county. What are your thoughts about the kind of rural-urban divide in Scotland? Has that kind of come up in your work, or is it something that you're kind of cognizant of as a kind of detailing Scotland as being a place of nuance? It's not just one thing. Does that? I was going to say, does it bother you? I mean, of course it bothers you. You're Scottish. It's annoying to be told that we're all one thing. But I wondered if that had factored into much of your work. And I'm thinking about your lovely adaptation of Girl Meets Boy, which is actually set up in Inverness.
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly the urban-rural divide is a forgotten conversation in the Scottish art scene quite often.
Yeah.
There's some incredible venues, like Leith Art Centre,
Mm-hmm.
Mull, like there's places that because they're not, I guess, in the central belt, don't get the focus
Mm-hmm.
when they're in fact often doing the most radical work in terms of what theatre actually is, which is about the community around a building. Like,
Yeah.
it's, you know, it's one of the most place-based things that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's come up for me, for instance, well, firstly, like I just directed a play at National Theatre Scotland called Exodus,
Yeah.
and it came to the Lemon Tree in Aberdeen.
Amazing.
Yeah, no, I mean, like maybe a week and a half ago, not long ago. And that did a tour that went, you know, a long run in Edinburgh at the Traverse, which is a really specific audience. And then it went to Peebles, it went to Mull, it went to Stornoway, it went to Aberdeen.
Amazing.
And we kept talking about what's the reception going to be at these different places and trying to predict it and feel it out. And the absolute truth is we couldn't predict it, not at all. And some places it's a very divisive play anyway, but some places it went down like in a sort of big night out at Wembley, like it was totally electric. And at other places it was just a little bit more reticent, and you know, and actually that wasn't to do with urban and rural. And I think that's often the assumption at the institutional level. And something like Girl Meets Boy, which was about a really specifically sort of outside central belt experience of queerness, which I know you and I can both talk to, is like was kind of got lost really when shown to a central belt audience, like a city audience relationship to, for instance, queer spaces is just totally different. And I think in a way, when that didn't, you know, it didn't get programmed to go further, currently there's a plan maybe down the line that actually it's totally fine that its audience isn't necessarily young Glasgow queers who've had 400 clubs to go to you know, their whole life, and like and it's still not easy, I know that, like I've lived it, but it's a totally different thing from your thing. And that storytelling can get invalidated as if it's not up to date in some way, when in fact it's just specific, you know.
It's funny, I think there is this tendency of like lived experience as well. I remember I grew up in Huntly, and I remember being thrilled / horrified that Huntly is now a cultural capital. Like Devon Arts are doing amazing things in Huntly, and you just think it wasn't like that for me. Like this is hard, you know, this is weird to look at our own experiences of growing up in rurality and urbanity and saying like, well, these are the things that weren't there. And I think it's great that the conversations are moving in positive directions. And I'd really actually like to talk to completely like Doctor Who TARDIS to the present day, because Exodus, have you got some images of Exodus for while we chat about it?
Controversial Exodus.
Yeah, Exodus is like a moment, I feel like. Debbie, I'm sure you can speak to the kind of themes and plot of the play, but essentially to my eye, this was the most close to the bone your art has ever run in terms of what was happening in the real world around it. I mean, could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So in this image here, you can see to the left of the screen, this is a character called Azia Rayo, who is a South Asian Home Secretary.
Okay.
Yes, and it's actually based on multiple politicians across parties. Of course, no one believes the writer when she says that now.
Of course,
Exodus is written by the amazing Nada-Rajah, who is actually a playwright alongside being an A&E nurse.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and her hobbies are martial arts. Like she's a mother. Like she's one of the most incredible women.
Can we vote for her? Is she standing for anything?
I would definitely.
Yeah.
So she's, as you can see, this is set on a train, and she's written this absolutely incendiary satire about a Tory politician, Asia, who's fighting for her place in the prime ministerial leadership race. And obviously what happened as we rehearsed was a prime ministerial leadership race started.
Absolutely wild.
Yeah, really incredible. And what happens in this play, for me, this play takes the form of a bouffon. So bouffon is like a cruel clown who provokes you and is a bit nasty and underhand, but then actually flips the tone at the end and reveals underneath the nastiness a pointing out of a lack of humanity. And I think the play takes that form because at the beginning, as you can see in this picture, that little green ball of fabric represents a baby that washes ashore right next to the Home Secretary, just as she's trying to do a photo shoot about her new immigration policies.
Oh gosh.
Yes, so Exodus is funny, it's extremely dark. There's a reason that I chose something really non-representative for the baby, you know, it doesn't look real for a reason. It's 4 women on stage, it's 4 outsiders. As you can see here, we've got the Home Secretary, we've got her SPAD, her special advisor Phoebe, who it opens on a scene of queer sex with her in it. Next there's Anna Russell Martin, who was in the show I did Panopticon, who is playing a working class Scottish journalist working for the Times. And then on the right you've got Habin, who is a refugee. It's an asylum seeker who is been hired to pretend to be the Home Secretary's mother.
Wow.
So it's a farce that is convoluted and mad. It also has a dance sequence to Halo by Beyonce.
I mean, of course.
But it was absolutely unbelievably close to real life. And what that meant was my job in every play is to work out how to calibrate it to the, you know, to an understanding for the audience's experience, you know. So I'm going, what's this text going to do? How's it going to land? What do I want them to leave with? And you can usually do that because the world is maybe relatively static. Whereas in this, it was completely fluxing. It was moving all the time. It meant that, for instance, there's a joke about the Prime Minister's on his last legs. That read very differently. There was actually a joke about a royal funeral.
I was going to say the Queen really, that was a big crescendo there, wasn't it? The royal funeral right at the end.
Anything that we said in this play happened. But I mean, I think for me, the big thing was, no matter all through all of that, was to retain the boldness of point that it was making. Actually really bold actor programming that play, because it's not it's not politically, you know, on side with institutions. Actually, like, it's critical of journalists' complicity, which never goes down well with any critic. And it's a farce with only women. And I did keep playing the game of, what if this was 4 men? And it categorically, I think, would have been better reviewed. However, more importantly, and it was in the end a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 star show. More importantly, the audiences actually loved it. It was one of the best-selling shows at the Traverse, and that's far more important in a play about the humanity of our immigration policy.
I think a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you're doing something right.
Yeah.
I really do. I think you're doing something brave. Like, that's it. And I don't mean brave in the kind of pitying, like, at least you were brave. Wait, I mean, like, genuinely, if it's evoking that broad of a spectrum, given what we're living right now, it's hitting a nerve, you know?
Yeah, our stage manager at one point went, this began as a farce and now it's just a documentary. But I'll admit, it's funny because I really don't actually care about reviews, and yet I still read them and get really impacted. So I'm like, it's one of those, like, both things are true. You know, like, what other job, I mean, actually several other jobs, but there's only a small set of jobs where people will write about you in a national paper in black and white and say how they think you're not very good at what you do. And actually all through this, I knew that was going to happen, because this is so divisive. And I kept saying to the team, you know, it's going to be pretty, like, fiery, it's going to be pretty electric, and everyone's like, yeah, rock and roll. And then on the day it comes out, you're like, actually, it turns out I really like approval.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the time, a lot of our conversations off screen are about the parallels between academia and theatre, and I think what we always come back to is, whether it's an academic piece of work or a show or a piece of dramaturgy or a piece of creative writing, the positioning of the self out there, the making of that vulnerability of, I have offered you something of my vision of the world as it should be, or as I critique it as being, to have someone reflect that back and say, not good, flat, misrepresentative, or, you know, I'm trying to think of other wonderful things that I've had in peer reviews. It's horrible, because it catches that bit of you. And I think there is a particular Scottish sensibility of not getting beyond your station. And I think it plagues a lot of people I know who are Scottish, whether it be by birth or by I don't know, osmosis. This sense of, don't get ahead of yourself, hen.
Yeah, massively. It's really, yeah, definitely. And it's you know, I remember growing up that, like, pretentious or wanky, more specifically, excuse the French, was quite a big insult. Like, oh, that's wanky, you know, it's
that's
too
wanky.
arty. And I remember having this, like, real rebellious thing of being like, great, I'm going to be more of that, you know?
Toulouse-Lautrec, bring it.
I remember, like, when I was 10, I got given this book by my, like, slightly mad uncle on, like, installation art.
Amazing.
And he was, like, a funny enough Aberdonian, like, mad artist. But I remember being like, yeah, I'll get into this. And I was, like, quite a neddy wee kid with this book on installation art, and I feel like that's, like, kind of stayed with me all the way through. Like, I'm not going to lose either side of that. And actually that ceiling that you're talking about, that we can repeatedly bump into for gender, for disability, for class background, for all the things, oh man, it's exhausting. Like, it costs you to bump into that. We both have said that a lot. But you sort of got to choose what problems you want. Like, do I want the problem of I'm going to bump into these limitations that are false and structural and actually can change, or I'm going to have the problem of living with myself, giving up and giving in, you know?
Yeah. And that's a decision that I think varies from day to day sometimes, doesn't it? Some days it's like, yeah, I can, and then other days you're like, I'm fine. I just won't today. Like, that's okay. I'm thinking about the future, I suppose. But it's funny because it's so tempting to dwell on these amazing things that you've created. Because I was thinking when you were talking about Exodus, I was thinking about Inquirer, which was your first show with National Theatre of Scotland, which was 10 years ago, not to make us feel old,
Oh my
but it was
gosh.
10 years ago. And that was a highly cerebral and researched piece of theatre that was quite a damning indictment of journalism in Scotland at that time. And I mean, you had big hitters. Maureen Beattie was in that cast. Billy Boyd was in the original Glasgow cast. What was that experience like, going from education into that, and how has that fed into your vision for what comes next?
Such a good question. It was my first professional theatre job.
Mm.
And it was assisting Vicky Featherstone and John Tiffany, who at that point were like, I'm sort of still are, I think, like incredible artists. But at that point they were quite distant to me as just
Mm-hmm.
names and icons, really. And it's funny you said we met in 2007, because National Theatre of Scotland was founded in 2006. And I
Wow.
think I know that's it. And so I'd have been 18, I think. So that was a kind of really formative couple of years, really, of like
Mm.
theatre. So to then in 2012 end up in their rehearsal room was phenomenal. And it was definitely the making of me. I have to say I was silent for about 2 weeks with fear.
Yeah.
I had class fear, I had imposter syndrome. I didn't actually know that all the terms that surrounded all the different stage managers. There's an ASM, a CSM, a DSM.
Mm-hmm.
That was stuff I hadn't got near yet, but I was determined to learn. And because of the nature of the play being verbatim, we had about 40 anonymous interviews with journalists done by other journalists. I leaned into the thing I knew, which was I could research, I could copy and paste every bit that we talked about that the team had got excited by, and I print it all out and I put it on the wall. And eventually I found a way to become part of the process of making it. And that's the beautiful thing about particularly those two directors. The role of assistant director, which I did a lot of, can vary. You can be anything from like a tea maid essentially to what I was in that room, which is a collaborator who was getting to learn on the job. And it was really, I think, probably one of the best of NTS's shows in terms of showing its values. It was a piece without walls in the most literal sense. It was scientific, but also without limits. It dealt with the Leveson inquiry, and then when it went on again in London, it updated, because just like the news, things keep changing, things keep
change. There's two more shows I wanted to ask you about in relation to the nature of contemporary Scottish theatre, and then we can maybe think a bit more speculatively about the future. But I've been thinking, two of my favourite, actually, of the shows that you've done, although they are all great, is Our Ladies of Perpetual Succour, on which you were an AD, and The Strange Undoing of Prudencia Hart, which ran just this Christmas past at Manchester Royal Exchange. I was thinking about it, and what you were saying earlier about Scotland being sort of, that working class but with a shelf full of books. Both of those plays display that in different ways, I think, because with Our Ladies you've got these rough and ready Catholic schoolgirls with beautiful voices who are suddenly thrust into a day out in Edinburgh, which goes to some wild places. It's of course based on The Sopranos by Alan Warner, which is a classic contemporary Scottish piece. And then with Prudencia, you have something that maybe puts the academia first, but foregrounds it in the artistry of balladry. I'd never put those plays together in my head before. How does that sit with you? What were your experiences of the two texts when you were working with them? Obviously with Prudencia you were much more able to push that forward into the direction that you had envisioned. But I know that Our Ladies was quite a personal one for you, and I think for me when I saw it, it really hit home in terms of being a teenager in Scotland at a certain point and feeling all of those feelings that those girls go through in that performance.
Yeah, I think there's such an interesting set of texts to link, and actually it just made me think there how little scholarship I encounter anyway, which is probably because I don't encounter much in general, but that does, for instance, draw a link across the landscape of works like that. because that is such a like rich area, and I think actually neither are particularly simple about class. Like
No.
you and I have discussed that thing of like Scotland's almost Scottish exceptionalism as like the do-gooder lefty socialist country with no complication to it, and yet both those plays actually both look at the true working class experience, and yet also don't leave it, you know, easy. They upturn all the other elements as well. Our Ladies was just a sort of documentary really of my childhood. Catholic schoolgirls in the 90s really misbehaving, except I would have been the very nerdy one, I think, that played the cello. But it's a beautiful thing because it's about the power of teenage girls, and one of the things I learned in that process, you know, directed by Vicky Featherstone and designed by Chloe Lamford, was how you handle the gaze upon a piece. So all those teenage girls, as a lot of teenage girls do, dressed up to go out, and they wanted to look sexy. However, we didn't want the audience to sexualize them, and I remember that being such a key learning point for me. So they've got mini skirts on, but they've also got cycling shorts on. And none of them look what you would maybe generally class as like hypersexual or really sexy or anything, but they absolutely are sexualizing themselves. And the space is theirs, and because there's no men on stage, like they play all the men. There was something about this play about these like choir girls that remade the world, like it literally remade the world in a possible image of something through a teenage girl's lens. And what an incredible thing to do. And it was because you know, it was these songs reclaimed by them, a pub space reclaimed by them, even sexy clothes, the most patriarchal of concepts, was reclaimed by them. And then that went to the West End, and I just think how many, and actually the National, and how many people watched that, as well as like, you know, Dundee, all the good and Australia. But like, how many people watched that and were like, oh, there's a version of womanhood, you know, or girlhood, or to be honest, just personhood that really doesn't get representation terribly often. Even now, it's a bit of a diamond in the rough. And I think Prue's the other, maybe Prue's an unseen Scottish type, actually. I feel like that's slightly tightly wound, you know, like tightly wound academic woman isn't appreciated or isn't centered in stories. She isn't like, she knows she's considered unexciting. She knows how she's seen. But then her intellect is what saves her, and her passion, actually. And it's kind of amazing that, for me, that Prudencia, that play is all about, at every level, breaking down binaries. The binary of academic, passionate, you know, of the heart and of the head, of the good and bad, devil, you know, angel. All those things in it are playfully, actually, with like a sense of silliness and accessibility, gently broken down until you wake up in the snow and everything's new again. And I think that's what, you know, really strong storytelling, and maybe even Scottish balladry, is often about in its core.
Absolutely. Do you have... No, I think that's so accurate, and as you know, it's a play I personally have a lot of affection for. Do you have images from Prudencia or any of your other shows to just look at? There they are.
So this
Midsummer.
I know, Midsummer, the Midsummer influenced preset. So this,
beautiful.
The cast, they're just stunning. And also these buildings that they're sitting on are actual buildings in Kelso, where it's set.
That's amazing.
This opening song is, as you're coming in, it's meant to be a session. And what we did was we had the most phenomenal MD called MG McCarthy, who works in Scotland all the time, and this person here who's called Malin, and they are, oh my gosh, like a prodigy.
Malin's incredible.
I can't advise you enough to look them up. And I had a real cringe about Scottish music, I'm going to admit that, just from being a lowlander who wanted to be cool. And I've completely relearned that now because of Malin. But this is them singing Little Nas X.
It was so good. Like, I wish we had a sound clip because it was brilliant. Wonderful. And
that was a real attempt to like take, you know, even Prudencia is about is it about 10 years old maybe?
Oh
It's,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
10, even 12 maybe. I think it was
yeah.
when we were still in Edinburgh.
So even this was a bit of an update of what a Scotland could look like. You know,
Yeah.
it's a cast of people who are all kind of bodies are there, and
Mm-hmm.
why couldn't Scottish music also include Little Nas X and be queered and
Mm-hmm.
be, turned into something with a lot of cheek and energy to it, because that's the actual impulse under that music in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And transcribing that. There's Prue.
We're in our car on our way to our academic conference.
Wonderful.
And it's funny because you've got middle class Peru here. This is Joanne Thomason beautifully playing the kind of slightly stuck up, tightly wound, Prudencia that we know and love. And then of course later on you've got these harpies who are the hen knight.
Oh, they were controversial, weren't they? Like in
Yes.
the press. That was the bit that the press were like, I don't think we needed a hen part. It's like,
No,
what?
and I think that's because they were absolutely unabashedly working class women.
Yeah, I completely
um,
agree with that, to be honest. Yeah.
and they're sort of really silly and
Mm-hmm.
clever and
Mm-hmm.
sort of bullies and also kind of mythological constructs.
Yes.
And I think sometimes that's too much. Like we just, A, collective misogyny, but B, we just cannot handle this idea of like a working class set of women who are like sexually empowered and funny and
Mm-hmm.
actually higher status than us.
Yes.
Because audiences really enjoyed them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the devil.
Oh, Paul Tinto?
Paul Tinto, yeah, who's
Amazing.
a regular on Scottish stage and London stage actually. And this is our beautiful floor on the set designed by Max Johns. And yeah, this, by the end of his falling in love with Prudencia, this is where we were left. And by that point, hell was no longer one thing, and neither was love. Um,
Yeah.
and then, of course, it, like all good plays, it turns into essentially a car chase.
Yeah. And I
um,
believe there's an electric scooter. No
oh yeah,
spoilers there,
yeah,
but yeah, the electric scooter
absolutely.
was a stroke of genius. Are there any other images you have? I'm wondering if you have anything from the Panopticon, which is probably a
Yeah, I mean,
text that's quite familiar to the audience.
yeah, the cult novel, The Panopticon by Jenny Fagan, who's absolutely phenomenal. It's about Annie, you can see a bit more clearer here, who is a 16-year-old going into a care home, and is essentially just trying to survive. For me, this
Mm.
play was all about the resilience of young people's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And at any point when I was directing and I didn't know what to do with something, I went back to that guiding principle, and it always opened it up and made
Mm-hmm.
it clear. Her arriving at the care home, and you can see here the different young people. Some repeat. There's Paul Tinto,
Oh, no way. Yeah.
Lawrence, who was also in Prudencia, and it was made of these 9 giant Toblerones, we called them,
Yeah.
that would spin around and reveal different rooms. I think the play had 52 locations.
That's incredible.
And to find a creative way of solving that was one of the great joys of the piece. This is when all the young people go on a sort of outreach education trip
Oh God, yeah.
to the Highlands, and get put into a dinghy, and of course that goes as well as you can expect.
Expect it to go,
I
yeah.
think Panopticon like sums up a lot of what I personally love, which is stories about people. I guess there's a sort of uniting thing with me of stories that you haven't seen before on stage.
Mm.
And I think with Panopticon, it linked queerness, it linked people, an anti-institutionalism
Mm.
in a nuanced and critical way.
Yeah.
It put young women at the heart of it. Had a range of working class characters, a range of ethnicities, a range of bodies, and to me that's the most exciting possible work, and is about a future vision of Scotland that I would hate to think that our theatre could get stuck. I always say this, perpetually in 90s Scotland, which is all about
Train spotting.
white men and
Mm-hmm.
glamorizing a sort of weird version of the working class that isn't
Yeah.
being written by them.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
that's my very critical take on
No,
it.
I think so. I think there's for me that scene in Train Spotting the film, the one that sticks out to me and the one that I think still resonates with me is Ewan McGregor sitting on that rock in the middle of the Highlands saying it's shite being Scottish.
Yeah.
that one monologue that he has. But what I think your work does is it challenges that, and it pulls it into a more optimistic view of what we can do to push back against that and to create within that space. And that's something that's like sorely needed. So I'm looking at, we've got a couple of questions. I've got some quick fire questions for you, but I think before we pop into the questions, and for the audience, if there is something you'd like to ask, please do pop it in there. I think I'd like to ask you, where to next for Scottish theatre, and how do we get there? And that's a huge question. So like,
Good question.
yeah.
You know what? The first thing I'm going to say is that the Oran Moor has just been bought over by the Scotsman Group, which used to be called G1. And Oran Moor hosts Play Pine a Pint, which is one of the biggest generators of new plays in Scotland. At the moment, Play Pine a Pint is safe, but I would urge everyone to look to ensure that that stays in the future. I think, like everything across the UK right now, we're at an apex where we've been doing more and more with less and less for so long that we've now reached this crunch point where we're losing all the diversity and inclusivity from the industry that the industry often goes on about doing all the time, or has a lot of boxes that it needs to tick, or EDI outcomes that it's trying to reach. However, we're structurally in this place where it's absolutely becoming untenable, not just for the institutions, you know, much more so for the artists and for the technical staff and for the production staff who cannot sustain staying in this industry. So for me, looking ahead, there's some big structural thinking to be done, possibly around making less work but better. Probably around having to rethink what it means to get money and to get funding. We need to think about making theatre in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and that can mean things like examining your budget line for redistribution of funding. Should you maybe try and host something in a library, and then you fund that library for 3 years? And also to do with like fair wages. You know, there's a lot of guidance policy on what you get paid in theatre, like the ITC rates, things like that. Those rates were already close to painfully unlivable and now have very much crossed the line, I think. And I think we need a bit of a reassessment of what that means. There's a lot of structural rethinking to do, and there's a lot of considering what impact is, I think, because impact is maybe stuck in a sort of 10-year-old world, and we need to go, what actually is impact now? And if it doesn't look the same, so it might not look as big or look as flashy or look like something we've known from before, that's okay. It's a big creative challenge, and nothing easy ever comes out of a financial crisis. However, theatre has a lot to offer after a time where we weren't allowed to leave the house or gather.
Absolutely.
Community, geography, you know, where we are, connecting with others. We've got a big offer to make, so let's not lose it because we're not catching up with the reality of our economic situation.
Absolutely. I think that times like this is when class comes to the fore as well, isn't it? Like any kind of, I don't know, disadvantage or economic struggle, just everything is multiplied.
Massively. And we're still not great at talking about class, you know, like it's not a protected characteristic, so you can't use it in that way. If you're in a meeting, in the way that I know I can talk about disability in a certain way, that means it has to ring considered red flags to an institution. You know, it's all about strategy, even as a freelancer. But actually, class is this sort of like, it's just the water we swim in. It's just all around us all the time, and we just accept it. I mean, on that note, universal basic income, that's the future of Scottish theatre.
Here. Because, the assumptions that you and I have both met in our lives of like, you're from Scotland, so X is true, or Scotland is a monolith of working class people, or Scotland is a monolith of this. It's so hard to unpack that, isn't it? I think we still struggle with that. We have some questions, so I'm going to go through the audience questions. Can I just point out, Emma Jane Park has agreed emphatically with you. Debbie says exactly that, less but better. So thank you, Emma. I can't see the names of any of the people who've answered questions, so this could all be one anonymous attendee, or it could be 4 different people. So thank you anyway for your questions. What resources did you use when you created Exodus? Did you get in contact with any actual refugees or use any real life testimony?
Yeah, I mean, the writer did, I would say, the real majority of that, because she's been working on it since about 2018, and had been researching real life testimonies from then. And she'd also had a lot of conversations with people who've been through the immigration system, even not as asylum seekers, because that in itself is very revealing. And when I put the team and the cast together, I wanted as many people as possible who in some way were interacting with the immigration system, so that they could speak to that. But what we did was use a lot of real life testimonies, and the character in the play is North African, and so we used a lot, but mostly specified to that specific journey, and then a lot of people who did the specific journey due to their sexuality. There's a lot of really bizarre, strange rules within that. You have to provide photographic evidence of your sexuality. Which of course is, yeah, I know, it's like what does that entail? So I'm like, how does one seek consent to be getting that? So yeah, so really, really tricky. The one thing I would recommend that even I used all through, just as a specific resource, there's an amazing podcast called Asylum Speakers. It's so good. It tracks the journey essentially of an asylum seeker, from choice to leave to being pushed back, which is horrendous, to reaching your first safe country, to why you might then leave that country. And that was like a massive way in to always, no matter what, because we did a lot of research on Conservative Party MPs, but always to balance that out with the voice of the people that we were trying to remind everyone also are human.
Absolutely. No, that's wonderful. Thank you. I mean, it's not wonderful. It's a horrific situation for humanity as a whole. But it's wonderful to hear about the process that you went through with such thought with the writer. This is a question I've actually wondered about. What are the main differences between the film adaptation of Our Ladies and your theatre adaptation?
Totally honest, I've not seen the film.
Neither have I. I'm so glad you said that.
Partly because I spent so many years with this show. I was like, oh my god, it's going to be so bizarre to watch this thing. However, I think it's probably been long enough now. I know that one of the biggest differences that I can name immediately is that the show is formally very like non-naturalistic.
Yeah.
And the film isn't. The film is, you know, as film lends itself to verisimilitude, like of course it's set in real places and has that quality to it. So I can begin to guess what that would mean, but I will go and find out.
Did anyone reprise for the film, or any of the girls approached?
No, none of the cast.
Did they just want to go younger? Could you have to be more?
I think because, you know, on theatre, you can, in theatre on stage, you can be a range of ages and body types and all of that, and it's actually to do with how you're acting, whereas of course film is so much more about what is the thing that we're going to see close up on the screen. And you know, and I think I've seen trailers for the film and I can see how it's still going to hold the spirit of that book.
You don't want a Dear Evan Hansen situation.
Exactly. Well put.
How do you do, fellow kids? Next question, should the National Theatre of Scotland have its own building / permanent theatre?
Such a good and controversial question. Oh my gosh, you know what, it's so, I don't know is the truth, but what I do know is that the NTS is so threaded into how every other building works in Scotland, well, certainly in the Lowlands, that I don't know what it would mean to like remove it from that tapestry, and maybe that's good. You know, like a bit of me goes, oh my god, what would that mean for the ecosystem? But maybe, having said the ecosystem needs to take a long hard look at itself, maybe that would be kind of great. I worry about having another building in the sense that, do we have the audience to fill it? I live for my sins in London, where, you know, I've just walked past another theatre that opened the other day and I was kind of like, why? Like, we don't need it. We really don't. And so a bit of me goes, I don't know if we need another building, but maybe we need a different way to work with all the buildings.
Well, the Pavilion is up for sale. I just read this morning in Glasgow. If anyone's got 3.9 million kicking around.
My one thought about being a national theatre, you know, the National Theatre of Britain is placed solely in London. And
Mm-hmm.
I would be more interested if National Theatre of Scotland got like 4 buildings and spread them throughout the
Yes.
country. That would be more interesting to me.
Yeah.
Than,
Hubs rather than.
yeah, than stamping Glasgow as our only cultural city that deserves like a big theatre place. And
I like that.
NTS is based currently in Rockvilla, which is in north of Glasgow.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of opening its doors to artists might be actually getting some more art, which they're doing right now through like the residencies. I've totally forgotten the name of. Develop is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Getting artists in through those residencies is making the building feel a bit more alive and owned again post
Yeah.
COVID, and I think that could be part of it. But if yeah, maybe I can't believe I've answered basically more buildings,
Not one, but
more hubs.
many. Yeah.
Speak to the whole nation. It's a
Yeah.
hard task, but I feel like NT Scotland and NT Wales are better primed for it than somewhere that has a singular building. Even with National Theatre Live, which goes out to cinemas, it's still not quite the same offer that the National Theatre of both those countries could do.
I mean, and it mirrors movements happening in the civil service, the BBC, even at the library is moving out of London and getting into, like, the library. British Library's doing a lot in the north in Leeds at the moment, and it's good, but it is tricky because you're asking questions about a very different perception of what audience and amenities are for. So it's these questions are, I don't know, COVID has started to accelerate them, I think, in a lot of ways.
A lot of the time when I'm talking about theatre funding with theatre people, they we tend to collectively reference Germany as like a sort of utopia. And basically because it's decentralized funding, there's not, Berlin is obviously a massive cultural hub, but it's not the singular one. There's significantly large, both in scale and ambition, work being done through towns and cities throughout the whole. And it's a dedication to decentralized funding. And I think whilst, we certainly are a long way off of that, in the UK, I mean, there's a chance that, National Theatre of Scotland, and I think it does do this actually and could do even more, can lead that sense of decentralization. Because we are, as you're saying, multiple,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think we're tiny, geographically tiny country, but we contain multitudes, And the next question, final question from the audience, actually kind of feeds into this. Do you think that Scottish theatre will move on to some more post-dramatical theatre forms in the near future, like has happened in the continental Europe, such as German, Poland, Italy, Croatia? Or maybe Brexit will influence it to rather stay within some safer, non-experimental dramatic narratives?
I mean, that's such a good question. I would love it if it did. That'd be so exciting. I think there's, I think realistically there is a financial crisis, and I think possibly that there is right now a sense of wanting to be safe in the sense of offering stuff to audiences that you think they're definitely going to like. That's true. I would say that's true across the UK. Every single theatre I'm speaking to right now, and that of course makes sense to a degree. I understand it. These are financially high risk times. However, that there is a form of risk in that has to be considered, which is about offering something that doesn't have novelty or truth or how often do audiences actually know what they want? Things on paper that sound like madness often go down a storm. I May Destroy You, for instance, to use a TV example, on paper doesn't sound like a really good investment, but it was absolutely genius and, sort of the hit TV show for me of the last 5 years. And I think right now there's a constant terrifying balancing of books being done. And that ultimately does absolutely, as I say, trickle down. That feels a bit loaded today. Does infuse into the programming decisions. Of course it does. But I think there is also a conscientiousness around making sure that there is space for experiment and there is space for emerging artists to try things that they want to do. And that could indeed be post-dramatic. I'd say Scotland loves the narrative, so I'm not sure if it'll very suddenly flourish as the form of the country, but what I hope is that, given things like Scottish Dance Theatre or Scottish Ballet's latest piece, I've not said out yet loud yet, Coppelia, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Coppelia.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's
Yeah,
Capelia. I don't know though.
Coppelia. Or indeed pieces that like Stuart Lang makes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of artists who, or actually, The Afflicted by Group Work,
Mm.
which is amazing. It's, based on a podcast about these American girls who kind of got a strange plague, part movement, part narrative, absolutely brilliant, directed by Findan Hertog. And I would say pretty much post-dramatic, it certainly danced around narrative,
Yeah,
literally and otherwise. I think that works exciting, and we've got to get behind it, basically.
excellent.
So my answer is, I think there'll be a lot of narrative, and there is a nervousness, but there's still spaces where people can carve out that kind of work, and I hope they do, because I think it's really exciting.
Excellent. Well, I think that's us just on time. I will save my quickfire questions for another day because we had some really great audience questions there. Just thank you so much, Debbie, for being with us today and for talking so generously and openly about your experiences. It was a really nice reflection, I think, of what you've achieved. And I think everyone here, including myself, is really excited to see what comes next, both for you and for Scotland. And I can't help but think that the two are very linked. So here's hoping. For the audience, thank you for being with us today. Just to let you know, there are some pieces of business for me to go over with you. Just to say, actually, thank you very much to the media services team and the WayWORD Festival folk for making this possible, particularly for letting us pivot to online. Leslie, you've been an amazing interpreter. Thank you so much for being here. And there are a number of people backstage who've really made this run very smoothly. Thanks again to Creative Scotland and the University of Aberdeen for the generous funding of the festival. And thank you so much for coming today, whether in person or online. You can follow the festival on all social media using @WayWordABDN. And all that remains for me to say is once again thank you to the audience and to Debbie. And yes, have a wonderful afternoon and a great rest of festival. Bye, everyone.